With Cyber Judge and Wild Forces having been released over in Japan for a couple of weeks now, they have already moved over to the new standard rotation of F, G and H marked cards, which means that we can get an early look at what our format could possibly look like post-rotation in April when Temporal Forces become standard legal. One thing that has caught the attention of a few players is the resurgence of a deck that, while it was good, its strategy quickly became obsolete thanks to a certain card in the format that a lot of players to this day hate. So what is this deck, you might ask? Alolan Vulpix V. Released back in Silver Tempest, this card was actually pretty good for the time. Its Vstar power required no energy and did 70 damage for each of your opponent's V Pokemon in play. So against certain decks, for example Mew, you could take a one-hit knockout whenever you wanted, since that deck plays almost exclusively V Pokemon. But that's not the reason why this card was so strong. That comes from its first attack. For 1 water and 2 colourless, it does 160 damage, which is fairly low compared to other V-Star Pokemon, but it also applies a secondary effect. During your opponent's next turn, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from Pokemon that have an ability. This secondary effect is incredibly strong, as most of, if not every deck in the format, has a Pokemon with an ability that is one of, if not the deck's main attacker. Gardevoir, Charizard, Miraidon, Lugia, Arceus, Chien-Pao, Palkia, Goldengo, the list just goes on. Even new cards we will be receiving in the next mainline set. This card just walls them and is basically invincible unless your opponent plays an attacker that doesn't have an ability, which only a few decks do. So why didn't this card see the level of success you'd think it would? Well, it's all because of one card, that being Path to the Peak. Pokemon with a rule box in play, both yours and your opponent's, have no abilities. Now you may be thinking, well, the Pokemon still technically has an ability, it's just turned off and can't be activated, right? Well, not exactly. Because of how cards interact and how they are worded, Path to the Peak removes the ability entirely. So now rulebox Pokemon don't have an ability at all, meaning that with Path to the Peak in play, cards such as Lugia, Miraidon, Gardevoir, Arceus, Palkia, etc. can attack and deal damage to Alolan Vulpix. However, over in Japan, since cards with the E regulation mark have now rotated out of standard, this means that Path to the Peak is no longer legal, and Alolan Vulpix has actually started seeing a resurgence in the format, and has even won a couple of tournaments as a control deck, using other cards that have similar shielding effects as its own, such as Mimikyu and Farajirif EX, while also disrupting your opponent with cards like Crushing Hammer, Pokemon League Headquarters, Giovanni's Charisma, and TM De-Evolution. Very powerful cards that can remove energy from their Pokemon, force them to attach more energy than needed for attacks, and de-evolve their entire board, which, if they only play Rare Candy and no mid-stage evolutions, could end the game right there. The deck does seem to be very strong considering its biggest weakness has now left the game, meaning that you can make full use of its protection ability. So if your opponent doesn't have a way of dealing with it, then they could have lost automatically. But that doesn't mean the deck is completely invincible to everything, as you are only protected from Pokemon with abilities, and there are certain decks that play non-V and EX Pokemon without abilities as their attackers, and some decks' main attackers that are V and EX Pokemon have no ability as well. Lost Box, for example, has Giratina and Sableye. There's also Gardevoir with Screamtail and Cresselia, as well as a plethora of other strong V and EX Pokemon with no abilities. And with Temporal Forces, we will be receiving even more. Plus, it's also important to note that Farajirif only protects itself from basic EX Pokemon, and Pokemon League Headquarters only applies its effect to basic Pokemon, not evolutions. However, even with its various weaknesses, this deck is far from being bad, because it most certainly isn't and will definitely see play for us once rotation hits. When it was released, it already had plenty of tools to make itself a viable control deck, and now that its main crutch will be leaving the game, it could possibly make a comeback as a very solid control strategy. Plus, the deck will be receiving a lot of new tools to play with enough time and possibly more cards released over the course of the year. Alolan Vulpix could very well solidify itself on the competitive ladder as a very strong deck to deal with, because if you don't have a counter for its numerous protection effects and disruptive cards, you could have very well lost the game right there and then.